here today, and I thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me. And this is I guess, a much broader talk than a research talk that I would normally give. I want to start by acknowledging that today I'm on the campus at the University of Victoria, and this week is National Truth and Reconciliation Week in Canada. Because of the land that I'm on, I want to start by saying I acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Let me see how to do next. There we go. Here's an outline of my talk, and I'll start off by defining equity, diversity, inclusion, and then I'll start to talk about how this weaves into understanding energy transitions and why energy geography in particular is helpful in offering us ways of understanding equity, diversity, and inclusion in the energy transition. And because I think there are junior scholars and also senior scholars in the group here, I want to end with what can we do as geographers and scholars with regards to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So equity, diversity, inclusion, these are words that we hear all the time. Equity refers to a process of removal of systemic barriers and biases that hinder the access to equal opportunities and benefits. Diversity refers to the composition of teams and a workplace or even a workforce or engagement that is representative of a wide range of races, ethnicities, genders, disabilities, sexual orientations, religions, age, and so on and so forth. And inclusion refers to the practice of ensuring all individuals are valued and respected for their respective contributions and skill set, and integrated in a meaningful way throughout decision-making and design processes. And I wanted to orient the talk by explaining or giving a definition of what these are. And I also want to acknowledge that there are different versions of this definition. Some of them include justice, some of them include decolonization, and sometimes we treat those issues together and separately. You'll see that my talk is full of eclectic images that I did right before I gave the talk, and I think they're fun. First, I want to talk about the various approaches to understanding energy transitions to help us really understand why, from my perspective, energy allows us to hold a multiplicity of perspectives and really understand how it's operationalizing. So this first view of energy transitions, this is the one of forecasts and scenarios, and they explain to us the scale of the transition. And this is an older graph. It's from 2017. There's many different versions of this graph. But what this graph really shows is the idea that as we decarbonize our global energy system, two things will happen. One is that the size of the energy system will grow if we keep up economic activity as it is and consumption. And the other piece is that we can see the blue, the dark blue, the light blue, and the greens. Those are all different types of renewable energy. And what we see is exponential growth of renewable energy into 2030, 2040, and 2050. And that's fairly significant. Here's another version of the energy transition, and this is more engineering and operational. And this energy transition is about taking our old system that's at the top, that operates in a straight line. It's very centralized. It goes from generation to transmission to distribution to demand. And we also can look at this in terms of extraction to transmission to distribution to demand, but it's very, very linear. And this transition that's very engineering is about adaptation to mitigate climate change. For example, a lot of us have heard about power systems going down because of storms or heat waves or wildfires or any number of reasons that are being impacted by climate change, and also to mitigate climate change. So at the bottom, what we see in the engineering perspective is a focus on the technologies and innovations that decarbonize and produce a more resilient grid in the face of climate change adaptation and mitigation. And so what you see here is a blend of what we would call centralized and decentralized technologies. So for example, we have supergrids that will be bringing renewable energy very long distances. We have smart grids, which is a digitally enabled grid that would be self-healing, that would allow resilience to the system. It would be better at predicting and managing disruptions. And then we have these microgrids. And these microgrids can be more local. They can isolate themselves from the grid. And what they allow for is they disrupt that one direction generation to transmission to distribution. And instead, you can see it's circular. We have bidirectional energy flows. We have what are called prosumers, which are organizations or people that are producing energy that goes to the grid and they're consuming energy. We have storage. We have distributed generation. So it's a very different way of looking at the energy transition. There's also financial aspects to the energy transition. And a renewable energy transition and any low carbon energy transition is going to require unprecedented investments in distribution systems and in new energy supply. So this has been estimated at somewhere in the tens of trillions of dollars to the hundreds of trillions of dollars in terms of all of the new installed capacity that we will need. And where this money goes, how it's invested, and who benefits from these investments is an important question. There's also, this is a technology innovation system. And so there's also institutional aspects of innovations. And this is about the kinds of policies that we have in place to support the development and diffusion of low carbon innovations. But it also shows not just institutions, but also the actors and the networks that are influencing this deployment. And we should be asking, who are the actors and networks influencing this deployment of innovation, development to diffusion in our low carbon energy transition? There are spatial aspects of energy transitions. What's interesting about renewable energy is that it is fairly different from other types of sources. And this is because renewable energy potential is place-based. And so these are maps of renewable energy potential in Canada. And what they show is that although we have the potential to produce enough energy to fulfill all of Canada's needs, including in decarbonization and under economic growth scenarios, much of the potential is very far from where it would be used. So the population centers are in red and purple in that very small graph in the middle in this really big country. But a lot of the renewable energy, so for example, in the purple graph, we've got wind, and where it's very, very dark, those are high sources of wind, and they're very, very far from population centers. So what this means is that energy transitions, particularly if we're relying on a lot of renewable energy, even if it's not exclusively on renewable energy, they're going to occur differently in different places, and we're going to need to use those supergrids, those smart grids, and those microgrids. And so energy transitions consist of major spatial and economic reorganization, and it will lead to different types of spatial pressures across landscapes and communities. This is one particular type of spatial pressure. This is my hometown of Toronto, and this is an image of the city of Toronto from 2014. And the area that they're showing in this image is where a lot of very high condominium towers are being built. And these towers are all, small communities with hundreds to thousands of people living in them. They are, anywhere from 10 to 30 to 50 stories high. And what happened was the city of Toronto started looking at all of the development that was happening. And then they looked at the transmission lines going into the city, which are these transformer stations that we have. And they said, we're not sure we're going to have enough electricity coming into the city in order to supply all of these condominium towers and all of this growth that's happening in the urban core. And this is why, for example, the dramatic growth of energy demand in cities is actually spatially constrained by supply options. And this is why cities will be increasingly a focus of innovation for energy, because there's so much pressure and demand for energy in cities, and it's constraining the supply going into them. And here's a visual summary of a research paper I co-authored with Jessica Conroy and Anna Burka. And it shows how energy transitions will happen differently in different places and form new relationships between cities and regions. So we were thinking about, I was teaching a course on community energy planning, and the students would always ask me a lot of questions like, why, how would this work? And one of the issues that came up that we couldn't really find an answer to was, how will cities decarbonize if they occupy such a small footprint and they use so much energy? And I didn't really know the answer, and I wasn't sure what was happening. And I was looking at literature and I didn't find the answer. So I wrote a research paper on it and had a grad student, Jessica Conroy, run a lot of analysis of the plans of very ambitious cities to use renewable energy. And so we looked at the plans of 47 different cities that were very, very ambitious and wanted to use exclusively renewable energy, or as much renewable energy as possible. And what we thought about in the paper was the fact that cities are these bounded spaces. They use most of the demand, probably over 2/3 of demand, global energy demand, but they occupy 2% of the Earth's of land space that we have available. And so what we're going to see, as I was talking about, is a lot of growth of population in cities. And on top of that, as we decarbonize our transportation sector, which is one of our largest sectors that we need to decarbonize, we will probably have growth in electric vehicles. And I think that a lot of that electric vehicle growth will be in cities. And a lot of analysis shows that. There are a few analyses that have been done, for example, a recent one by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And what it shows is that as we increase the reliance of heating and transportation on electricity, their analysis showed that the grid could grow by as much as 38% in the US, as an example. So what does this mean? Will cities be able to self-sufficiently produce renewable energy? Our analysis showed probably not, and that cities are already trying to source renewable energy from surrounding regions, which is what a lot of the small amount of literature we found said. And so we will probably find a lot of this place-based renewable energy in regions that will import renewable energy into cities, and cities, this will create new economic relationships. And some of the research that we're doing in my lab right now is looking at those types of details. What are those new relationships that are occurring, and how are cities setting up to procure renewable energy from surrounding regions? So overall, energy geography captures a lot of these different forms of transitions. So they capture things like path dependency and initial conditions, the decentralization of actors and infrastructures, the importance of governance, the proximity of supply and demand actors and infrastructures, the location and landscape of renewable energy resource potential, network constraints, reliability, and demand, land use planning, spatial planning tools for renewable energy siting and analysis, urban density and demand of urbanization, and the interscalar relationships between demand and supply locations. So energy geography really, it can hold a lot of these different things and processes and phenomena that are occurring in an energy transition. And it allows us to really understand how various communities and actors will be engaged throughout the process, which is the link to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I would say that energy geography offers us two ways to understand equity, diversity, and inclusion in energy transitions. One is about social innovation. And I found that there were only a handful of studies or articles that define social innovation in relation to energy transitions. And so Whitmire et al., they define it as a range of social phenomena relating to changes in energy systems. And so these can be around production and consumption of heat, electricity or mobility, engaging citizens and other actors in activities such as community energy, innovative business models, energy sufficiency or conservation. It should not say conversation, games and nudging. But the other way that energy geography offers us to understand equity, diversity, and inclusion in energy transitions is this reliance on rural and regional communities. And Nauman and Rudolph and Pogge, I hope that's the right pronunciation, they've been saying that regions will provide the net export of renewable energy to urban centers. But there are also studies that show that the spatial rollout of renewable energy has equity impacts and equity trade-offs between locations. So we need to be really careful about which technologies we roll out and where. And some of my research has looked at Indigenous rights to traditional lands in settler colonial societies and their participation in renewable energy production. So in terms of social innovation and energy transitions, on the right, this is an image from a paper I published a few years ago about renewable energy communities in the European Union. And what it shows is a lot of different actors who are going to be involved in this renewable energy transition if we hope to operationalize that engineering perspective of having a resilient system with lots of different innovations that balance each other out.
How interesting.
For a reliable grid. So this could be through conserving energy, implementing deep energy retrofits, having different actors become prosumers by consuming and producing their own energy. So for example, putting solar panels on a rooftop for self-consumption and selling electricity in the grid. We also really need to build in, engineers are really interested in flexibility. And so how are we going to build in demand response and load balancing, which means changing how much electricity consumers are consuming at certain times of day with the goal of having enough electricity supply for all electricity users at any moment in time. It could also involve owning electricity generation infrastructure like solar panels or wind turbines that are sold to the grid as renewable energy.
Thank you.
I love all these little commentaries that are coming in. So that could be, for example,
Christina, I'm just going to interrupt you really quick and mute all participants, and then I'm going to unmute you, okay? Because I think we might have some uninvited, or not uninvited, but some folks who are. Okay, I'm going to mute all. And okay, Christina, can you still talk?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Okay, cool. Yep.
Great. And there's also this idea of peer-to-peer, so trading or sharing electricity with neighbors on a local microgrid, and also moving towards self-sufficiency by generating their own energy for self-consumption and reducing energy use. And this is all from a book chapter that's under review that I've been writing. So the idea behind the social innovation piece is that we're going to have a good proportion, most actors on the grid acting towards at least some of these different new social innovation roles on the grid. And this can't be just a few one small group of people. But what we need is our citizens, consumers, small and medium enterprises, and larger enterprises of a range of actors to participate in a wide variety of ways. And so in a lot of ways, diversity and social innovation is at the core of an energy transition, particularly if we're going to adapt to climate change or incorporate more renewable energy. So now I want to talk about the diversity gap in the energy transition. I think I've shown what a transition could look like, keeping in mind, you know, the biophysical laws and parameters and what engineers think that we can do. So I really like this paper by Jenny Liu et al. And they talk about mainstream energy pathways and off-stream energy pathways and transformative pathways. And we can really see a lot of different people who are arguing for EDI and energy transitions say that climate and energy policy has been dominated by technocratic solutions formulated within decision-making circles that lack gender diversity. And gender diversity is really like the first form of diversity that's being looked at in EDI and energy transitions. But that's not to say there's so many other forms of diversity that deserve to be acknowledged and engaged with. But the energy sector is one of the most gender imbalanced in the world and also responsible for most of carbon emissions. And women account for as little as 10% of the energy workforce overall. And so Liu et al., they argue that transformation of energy systems involves all gender perspectives incorporated into all decision-making aspects of policy. So really, they're arguing for diversity and inclusion. This is some research that I conducted for the McConnell Foundation, and this is currently under review for a journal. I wrote it with Dr. Jenny Stevens, Yushu Zhao, and Pavel Hernandez. And what we can see on the left-hand side is the diversity of Canada. So we have, for example, 5% Indigenous people. We have a fairly large percentage of youth, 50% women, transgender, non-binary people. Seniors are in a similar proportion to youth. Northern communities, coastal, racialized, immigrant, and low-income communities form the makeup of Canada. And for example, racialized and immigrant communities are quite large. They're very substantial in Canada. On the right, we can see that when we think about the energy workforce, women make up 25% of the renewable energy workforce in Canada, but close to 50% of the workforce. And as I mentioned before, globally, women make up 32% of the energy sector, and racial and ethnic minorities make up 22%. And this is only of what we measure. So we don't really measure all of the different diversity categories, and we don't have a complete picture of what's going on in the energy sector. But in this research that we conducted for the McConnell Foundation, what we were asked to look at what are the organizations and actors who could be funded by philanthropic foundations that are participating in the low carbon energy transition. And so we looked at this, and we found 462 organizations, and we found 106 were being led by equity deserving groups that we called diverse leadership. And the various types of diverse leadership that we found are outlined in the bottom table on the left. So Indigenous, youth, gender, racialized, seniors, immigrant, northern and coastal, and low income. On the right, we have a graph that shows that of the 356 organizations that were conventionally led, we didn't find any indication that it was a diverse leadership running the organization or governing the organization. We found that for the most part, less than half were explicitly addressing equity deserving groups. So we can see here that 52% of the conventional led organization are addressing youth, 44% were addressing Indigenous people, and far less were addressing racialized communities, gender diversity, and all of the other groups that I mentioned. And it could have been that they actually were addressing them. They just didn't advertise it because we were looking at websites. But still, this is not necessarily encouraging. So if we go back, for example, to this idea of the innovation system, and the development and diffusion of low carbon innovations that will help us in this energy transition to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And we think about the types of policies we have in place that support that development and diffusion. My analysis makes me wonder, who are the actors and networks influencing this deployment and this energy transition? And we haven't really looked very carefully at that, but we do know right now that most of the sector is fairly male dominated. Looking at the other piece around regions and rural areas supplying energy, some of my own research has looked at the leadership of Indigenous communities in renewable energy diffusion. And so this is a map of territories and treaties. And if you remember the previous maps I showed you of renewable energy potential, it overlaps with renewable energy potential. And so attention to Indigenous communities, people, and their rights is critical to a renewable energy transition. And so my research, I've got a couple of papers that are, there are images for them here. We analyze that, and I'll share the results of a little bit of the analysis. So in one project, we looked at 194 projects across Canada with some form of Indigenous community involvement identified. And we argued that reconciliation would be measured by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that outlines that Indigenous people have inherent rights to control development on their traditional lands. And so we did a very blunt analysis, and we argued that reconciliation would be found through equity ownership, which denotes control of projects on traditional lands. And so we took a look at these projects, and these are the results. We found that very few projects were Indigenous owned, particularly the projects on traditional land outside of the reserve, where First Nations are often forced to live by colonial policies. So we found, for example, that 60 projects on traditional land had no Indigenous ownership, 19 had minority, and only 14 had majority ownership by the Indigenous community. There are other ways of measuring reconciliation and thinking about it. This was simply one analysis that we gave, but we did not find indication of controlling shares over projects on traditional lands. And then we asked, well, you know, maybe it was improving over time. Maybe those were old projects, and now we're looking at new ones. But what we found was that when we looked across different timeframes, so pre-1975, 1975 to 1999, 2000 to 2009, and then 2010 to 2020, which were the newer policies, a lot of those projects were actually built in the newest time frame. And when we found that the majority of projects were not, did not have equity ownership on traditional lands. So that's just an appetizer of some of the research that I'm doing that relates energy transitions and energy geography with equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think that there are many, many more from this community in particular that show how energy geography can really highlight the importance of EDI in energy transitions. And so I want to end the talk by briefly shifting focus and talking about what can we do as geographers and scholars to promote EDI in our research and analysis. So this is from a paper that I authored, and I'll show you the paper at the end if you want to look it up. It was about equity, diversity, and inclusion in energy transition research. And I argued that we need to be thinking about finding, creating spaces, and reading, teaching, and sponsoring. So the first question I think we should be asking ourselves is, what are you doing to promote the research of a diverse group of researchers? And to me, I've seen people say, ask who's out there, and I don't think that's enough. I think you need to think about what is your sphere of influence and how are you using it to promote a just transition and to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion. So in teaching and supervision, are the articles and readings in your course syllabi by women, non-binary, Indigenous, and people of color, and so on? And who are you mentoring and training? In literature reviews, are you reading, citing, and publicly recommending articles and research on energy transitions from equity, I should say, deserving groups? And if someone is not trying to solve the same problem you are trying to solve, what is their point of view? In networks, are you providing enough references for tenure and grant evaluations for scholars from equity deserving groups? Are you providing sponsorship by putting forward the names of scholars from equity deserving groups? Are you thinking about the adverse consequences of well-meaning academic policy that you are involved in implementing? And some people will ask, well, how would you know diversity in authorship? And the way that I've done it in the past is to look for authors rather than by topic, and to do this through networks. So some of the networks you can do this through, there's the Climate Social Science Network, which operates and scholars can join. There's the Wiser Network, which is a network of women and non-binary scholars working on energy transition research. And there's also the Donors of Color Network, which is the first ever mapping of BIPOC scholars with PhDs or other terminal degrees who focus on climate and energy justice. If you are working in a lab or leading a lab or a research project, you should be asking yourself, are you attracting and including diverse people in your group? And so, do you have funding structures that attract and support diverse candidates? What's the governance of your group and the meetings? Are roles and responsibilities and conflict resolution mechanisms laid out? Are authorship agreements transparent, discussed, and aligned with acknowledging contribution? And you could think of many more examples. And this is, I think, a new thing for me. I'm reviewing quite a few papers at the moment because, in particular, there's a lot of scholarship right now around Indigenous community participation in energy transitions. And I'm sure there's a lot of scholarship around diversity and inclusion in energy transitions coming out that you're aware of. So some research will involve communities directly and some may not. So for analyses that are more technical, are you working to inform a broad group of stakeholders and rights holders of your research findings so they can use them in decision-making? Are equity considerations incorporated at the outset of your research project? In case of the research that I do with Indigenous communities, I always do it in partnership with an organization. I never embark on it on my own. And so that is one model that you can do when doing research with or for equity deserving groups. Are you working in partnership with or in service of equity deserving groups or communities? Are you doing research that benefits equity deserving groups as defined by them? Are the methodologies you use accepted by the communities or groups you're working with or studying? And have you sought community permission or ethics approval? And I'm currently writing up the results of a project we did with Clean Energy BC and the New Relationship Trust, where we documented the socioeconomic benefits and impacts of renewable energy for a group of First Nation communities in BC. And they hired us because they want to put forward a case for First Nations Power Authority. And so this documentation would support them in doing that. And in our research, we had to get ethics approval from all of the communities that participated in the research. So we had consent from the community, and then we had consent from the participant. And it was a bit more complicated than what I've done in the past, but it was also the correct way and the most ethical way to go about doing the research. If you're interested in learning more, I've already mentioned 2 publications. This talk was really from those 2, but also from this paper I wrote with Jessica Conroy and Anna Burka, reconfiguring actors and its infrastructure in city renewable energy transitions, a regional perspective, as well as a perspective piece that I wrote for energy research and social science that Benjamin Sovacool invited me to write. And it's called How Do We Practice Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Sustainable Energy Research? Advice for Modern Researchers. I've also brought in a lot of my thinking and results from a book chapter and a paper that are under review, so you can look out for those whenever they come out. And I really appreciated the opportunity to speak today, and I can see that I'm within time, so I'm pretty happy about that. I'm really happy to have a discussion with this group and hear your questions and thoughts and think about how, as geographers, we can navigate a way forward, incorporating EDI considerations into energy transitions and energy geography and geography. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was an amazing talk. I think that's given us all really a lot to chew on and wrestle with and think about how we can include in our own research. I have a question, but I will open the floor, and I guess I will allow participants to unmute themselves. Hopefully that is an okay thing. So yeah, if you have a question, please go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can type it in the chat. And yeah.
Might jump in, Christina, if no one else is going to go. First of all, I'm a little bit embarrassed by the hackers joining the, the talk, but I will also say that on the other hand, in all my time using Zoom and virtual platforms since COVID, that's the first experience I've ever had with someone hacking. So I guess they've deemed us worthy of their disruption.
Yeah.
But you handled it yes, very, very smooth. Lots to think about. And my question is really about the role of men, and particularly white males. Do white men have a particular role in advancing, considering the data that you've shared with us, advancing more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive spaces within energy transitions, considering the disproportionate amount of space that white males take up in all of the processes that you've talked about?
Yeah, it's funny. I had an experience. I was on a proposal for a research project, and then someone asked me to write the equity, diversity, and inclusion portion of it. And so I brought in I said, okay, well, I worked with two other people. They were both white men, and we came up with a series of activities. And I think one of my concerns was around bringing a group of people together and then having like really interrupty spaces. That was one. There's many, many different things that happen, but interrupting spaces or people getting spoken over, it's not always, the culprit's not always, a certain group, but that kind of thing, I was trying to address it. And so I brought in readings around how do we create inclusive spaces and how do we give credit to people, like, for what they're doing. And one of the readings was from the Government of Canada, and it was about calling men and boys into gender diversity and equality. And the Government of Canada, I think it was the Ministry of Gender or something, put this out. And so we put forward this whole package of activities we were going to do. And somebody who you would expect blew up in the meeting over that reading, calling in men and boys. And they said it was discriminatory. And maybe it is. But I figured if the Government of Canada put it out, it's probably quite important. So I think it's really about, I think we need to have everybody on board with these things, and that includes white men, and it includes other people too, in terms of, and I think we need to be thinking about, again, all of those readings, whose voices are we elevating, that kind of a thing. And I think your question might be indicating around power dynamics. So there is a power dynamic around whiteness and maleness. And there's also power dynamics around things like tenured professors versus students and graduate researchers or sessional or pre-tenured professors. So I think that there's a range of power dynamics that we really want to be thinking about. As I said in that piece, like what are you doing to promote things? And so I think that where you have the time and the energy and are able, the ability and the power to do it, then you should be focusing on, how do I say this? Like, my perspective is sponsor people, you know, give them opportunities for them to do their own thing and bring their voice in and shine. And move away from this approval piece, like whether or not you approve, let's bring more voices into research and into what we're doing. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Great, thank you. And thank you for your presentation.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, yeah. I found the hackers a little bit amusing. So a little bit like crank calls from when I was a kid. So
yes.
Before caller ID. So yeah.
Could have been worse. We have one comment in the chat. Maybe you could go back to that slide, Christina, that mentioned networking and finding your people.
Yeah.
A few slides back.
This one right here, I think. You can let me know.
Yeah, Wendy, let us know if you want to follow up.
Is this the one?
Oh yeah, that.
Let me just. Oh, next one. Okay. So these are just 3 networks that I'm aware of. But and I mentioned them all actually in the publication. So if you go and look up that publication I wrote, they're all in there. And there might be other ones. Yeah.
Great. Well, I will jump in with a question then I had, which it goes back to at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the predictions and needs for financing, and something I'm wondering if you could comment on is and that I'm grappling with in my own work is these emerging calls for the level of private sector finance that should be leveraged to bring about energy transitions at the scale and the urgency with which we have to do it. And I've been really interested in Lucy Baker's work, who draws out a tension between energy transitions as a sort of asset and potential for profit and investment, and then these other more social and diverse goals that an energy transition might bring about that probably could have, you know, pathways to incorporate more diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that can really sit in tension with basically, you know, big bottom lines. And so I was wondering if I don't know how you think about that, or how you've maybe had touch points with that in your work.
Yeah, Dr. Baker's work is really interesting and really good and important. I guess the way that I think about it is in terms of a lot of people in policy and public sector think about, and business think about, my research as social acceptance. And so how do we bring about social acceptance of energy transitions? And one really big way of doing that is to Rand and Hohen have looked at this in a meta-analysis, and a lot of studies and research points to the part where if communities and people are involved in decision-making and involved in benefiting from the outcomes, which is why we looked at the benefits of socioeconomic benefits of renewable energy in our research, then they're more likely to support it. That's how you bring about support. And right now I'm working on a few projects where we're looking at how would you roll out this technology. One is we're looking at a technology, long-term storage. I'm also looking at starting a project on improving the efficiency, doubling the efficiency of green hydrogen production. And so how would you think about that and roll that out? And so I think in some cases with energy infrastructures, and I haven't thought this all the way through, but I mean, if you think about Arnstein's ladder of participation, in some cases, people will not be able to own the asset, but there are other ways of engaging communities so that they're, and then other parts, it will be about investment. And so the research we did on renewable energy communities in the European Union, it's the new next iteration of the feed-in tariff law. And the feed-in tariff really focused on cooperatives and local cooperative ownership. And the renewable energy communities is about having different owners. So it could be incumbent utilities, it could be municipalities, local small and medium enterprises, and then citizens all co-owning these renewable energy projects where nobody has a controlling share. And so the idea behind that, I think, is to bring about enough investment, but also blend that with social acceptance. And so I think I don't look at situations where there's backlash or coercion, even though that we know that that happens. And there are other researchers who look at those power dynamics. But I think that the investment piece that's going to be interesting is that if you want to have these projects actually built in a time frame, how do you get people to accept it? And another piece of that is around our research with Indigenous communities shows for many, but not all Indigenous communities, there's a really strong desire to produce renewable energy for local economic development. But there is large, because of the business models that they use, it brings about financial risk to the community. And so how do we deal with access to capital and borrowing in the transition, again, so that we can actually accomplish the transition and bring about that social acceptance that we need? So that's one piece of the way that I would probably think about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to turn on your camera, unmute. If there's any other thoughts to share. Well, I guess I'll ask a follow-up then, actually, about something you made me think of there, Christina. Have you been involved with projects where you've really felt like, well, I guess you said none where you felt like it was coercive, but I guess social acceptance, sort of assumes that the project ought to, I don't know, do you ever find yourself in tension between like communities you're working with and an energy project that's going on?
I haven't done research like that. I don't think, but what I have found right now are, I think we in the area of energy transition research, and I'll be interested to hear what Dr. Jenkins says when she presents on energy justice, because she's got some really interesting perspectives. I've been reviewing a lot more and also working in different projects. And so there's a really, really big focus right now on justice for and in energy transitions, but how that's being operationalized, I think there's a lot of different ways of understanding that and operationalizing it. And so in Canada, at least doing research with Indigenous communities is the norm. And so we would not accept research that's done on Indigenous communities. And that sometimes is a perspective that's not well understood from other cultural contexts. And so seeking that, for example, like I only do that research when I'm invited to the party. And then I otherwise won't do that research. And that research, usually we have some kind of a contract where the organization has control, and they're the ones helping us decide on the methodology and that kind of a thing. So I think that I'm seeing a lot of change in energy transitions research, and sometimes I think methods might fall a little bit flat, or we're learning how to do I think the most inclusive and just way of doing things, but so that's one area where I'm seeing tensions. Yeah. And I'm also seeing it in terms of reviews of articles, including my own, where those different research perspectives and cultural perspectives and histories and where the spaces we're occupying come out in reviews of papers. And there are other areas of research where engaging equity with and doing research, co-developing research with equity deserving groups has been going on for a very long time. But this is a really new thing, I think, in energy transitions. And it's a really big paradigm shift. And I think that it can be a challenge. So it's really it is challenging for sure. So yeah. That's where I'm seeing like tensions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks for the question. I hope reorienting it was okay.
Definitely. Yeah. No, that was really an interesting way to take it. Maria, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. Maria. Thank you. Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry I don't have my camera on because it's Denmark. It's very late in the evening, and I'm just completely Friday evening. I cannot put myself together, but very interesting. Thank you so much, Christina, and really thank you to put up with the hackers, because it really freaked me out. It's the first time I've seen this, and I don't know. You continue so smoothly. Thank you for that. It guided us. I just wanted to push you though, with the question of inclusion and justice. Yeah. Because it's a big tension. It's not a small tension there. I mean, to some extent, how far do you go with the inclusion? Because there is this issue of consent and for the projects, and in your vision, you sort of have this idea that renewables somehow are kind of harmless to some extent, developing them, and they will be developed a little bit in the outskirts, and they will serve the cities. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of tension there as well, because where's the space, where's the land, who owns the land, who's benefiting, all of these questions arise. And then of course we want to be fair and have these projects and the inclusion part and the diversity part and all of that you're mentioning and pushing and really showing us great research. But don't you feel this tension? How are you going to resolve this tension in your research moving forward? The tension between justice and inclusion, and the justice part that is kind of coming. You just started to talk about it, Laura. I just want to push you a little bit more and then see how it is, particularly with Indigenous communities. that that question is more relevant. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, Maria, I appreciate the question and pushing. So I was I was asked to frame the research around equity, diversity, inclusion. And I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes that includes justice and not, and sometimes decolonizing. And some of my research, a lot of it comes from a justice perspective and around those tensions. And so I think those are really important questions to be asking. And no, I absolutely don't think, and most of my work doesn't show, I would say, that there's not these tensions. They absolutely exist. And with renewable energy, there's also, issues of finite materials, rare earth metals, and magnets. So I was showing really an analysis of how the biophysical aspects of how it would play out, the engineering aspects, and then the types of questions that geographers should be asking, which is, I think, what you're asking, which I think is really important, that we need a lot of different views and asking about those tensions and how they fit. And it just happens that I've done research with communities that want to produce renewable energy. And I haven't done research with communities that are, for example, challenging it, or where they're, and the communities that I've done research for, they are in conflicts with the incumbent utility, but in different kinds of ways. And they also have their own community conflicts. So I would agree with you completely. And I think my overarching view is that we really need to have a multiplicity of researchers and voices and questions being asked about this to think about those things. Does that answer your question, Maria?
Yes. Thank you very much.
No, thanks so much for
I
the
know
question.
it's not easy, yeah.
And for highlighting that. And I think also just part of what I was trying to highlight was that when you think about that innovation system and all of the things that are influencing those technologies rolling out, whether they're renewable energy or something else, it's, who are the actors and networks influencing that? I think we need to ask those questions. And my research shows there's not a lot of diversity, at least in Canada, influencing that rollout. My guess is that that's probably the case in other places.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
All right. Any other questions out there, or final commentary from Dr. Hoicka? All right. Well, I just want to say a big thank you again, and thank you so much for your calm and grace for handling the, my first time with hackers too. But yeah, thank you so much for being so calm and collected, and really giving a great talk. And I think there's a lot that I at least want to chew on and reflect on. So thank you so much all for joining us as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Christina, and sharing your really, really important research with our community. Much appreciated.
Thanks for the invitation and for having me.